She maltreated her husband after he lost his job and divorced him. But years later, the billionaire she begged for help was him. Shame on you. You can't even feed me, and you still expect me to call you my husband? Dan Parker used to be the man everyone in Atlanta respected. Regional operations director. Six-figure salary. Company car. Health insurance for the whole family. He called it security. His wife, Melissa, called it bare minimum. Then the layoffs hit. 3 weeks after Dan's company downsized, Melissa stopped pretending. She talked to him like he was an embarrassment she was forced to live with. "You're a grown man," she told him in their high-rise apartment kitchen. "And I'm out here paying rent on my credit card like some single mother. This is not what I signed up for." "It's temporary," Dan said quietly. "I've got interviews. I just need time. Time doesn't pay bills." The nanny, Grace, stood in the doorway holding a laundry basket. She heard every word, same as their 7-year-old son, Mason. That night, Melissa didn't come home for dinner. She said she had a meeting, but she came back at 1 a.m. in a tight dress, laughing on the phone with someone named Marcus, VP/private equity. Dan lay awake on the couch. No job, no health plan, mortgage behind. He stared at the ceiling and whispered, "God, please don't let my son grow up thinking I'm nothing." The next hit wasn't emotional. It was metal. 2 days after Melissa called him dead weight, Dan got into his old Ford to drive to a warehouse interview on the edge of the city. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't executive level. It was $18 an hour night shift. But it was something. He never made it. A drunk driver ran a red light near Howell Mill Road and hit him hard on the driver's side. The car spun, slammed into a pole, and folded in. By the time paramedics cut him out, his left leg was a mess, his ribs were fractured, and his shoulder was torn. When the hospital called, Melissa sounded annoyed, not scared. "Is he conscious?" she asked the nurse. "Yes, ma'am." "Okay, so he can talk. Can you give him the phone? I need him to explain how I'm supposed to cover rent if he can't walk." The nurse went quiet. Grace showed up 20 minutes later. No hesitation. No questions. Hair still wrapped. Hoodie, leggings, sneakers. When she saw him, she covered her mouth. "Daniel," she whispered, using his full name like she always did when she was worried. "What did they do to you?" Dan tried to smile. "I'll be fine." He didn't look fine. Grace didn't believe him. She sat beside the hospital bed and held his hand. He fell asleep holding hers. 3 weeks later, Dan came home from the hospital in a wheelchair. The cast on his leg made it hard to move, but what hurt more was the silence in the apartment. Melissa wasn't there. On the kitchen counter lay a note. "I can't do this anymore, Dan. I didn't marry a patient. I married a man with ambition. Maybe when you get back on your feet, you'll understand." No signature, just her wedding ring on top of the note. Grace was the one who rolled him inside. She'd taken Mason to stay with her sister for a few days. "You need rest," she told him gently. "I'll take care of things here." Dan couldn't speak. His pride was gone. His wife had left, his savings were drained, and every time he saw his reflection, he saw failure. That night, Grace cooked soup in the small kitchen. She didn't talk much, just moved quietly, humming gospel under her breath. When she handed him the bowl, Dan whispered, "Why are you doing this?" She smiled softly. "Because you did the same for me once when I had nowhere to go." He looked up. He'd forgotten. But she hadn't. And that night, for the first time in months, he slept peacefully. Recovery wasn't glamorous. It was painful, humiliating, and slow. Dan spent his mornings learning to walk again in a crowded public rehab center, gripping a metal rail while the therapist counted aloud. Grace was always there, quiet, patient, steady. Melissa never called. Not once. Some days, Grace would bring Mason to visit. The boy ran to his father every time, arms wide. "Daddy, when you walk again, can we go to the park?" Dan smiled, hiding the pain. "Soon, buddy. Real soon." Grace would wait outside the therapy room, watching through the glass as Dan fought through every step. Sweat poured down his face. His hands trembled, but his eyes stayed locked forward. After each session, she'd help him back into the car, pack away his crutches, and drive him home in silence. One evening, as the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, she said, "You know, Daniel, the body heals slower when the heart's still broken." He looked out the window. "Yeah, I think mine's still in pieces." Grace nodded. Then maybe it's time you build something new. Not for her, but for you. He didn't answer. But that night, Dan opened his laptop for the first time in months. The glow of the laptop screen lit up the dark living room. Grace had fallen asleep on the couch. Mason curled up beside her after another day of school and therapy. Dan stared at a blank document on his screen. He couldn't go back to corporate. Nobody would hire a man with a limp, a gap in his resume, and a reputation for poor adaptability. But what he did have was knowledge, years of logistics, supply chain strategy, and efficiency models. That night, he started writing ideas for a startup. Something small, something online, a logistics consulting platform for small businesses that couldn't afford big firms. He named it Blue Path Solutions. Sounds like hope, Grace said the next morning when she saw the name. It's just an idea, Dan shrugged. Big things start as small ideas, she replied, pouring him coffee. Months passed. The website went live. Grace helped design flyers. Mason helped hand them out at local shops. The first client came, a small furniture company struggling with deliveries. Then another. Then 10. Within a year, Blue Path Solutions moved from his living room to a rented office space in downtown Atlanta. Grace watched quietly as Dan walked through those doors, cane in hand, determination in his eyes. By the second year, Blue Path Solutions had gone from a hopeful startup to a name whispered across the logistics world. Dan's efficiency software, a system he built himself while still in recovery, caught the attention of investors in Silicon Valley. A venture capital firm offered him $2.5 million in seed funding. Within months, partnerships with major e-commerce companies followed. Grace couldn't believe how fast things changed. From late-night brainstorming in a one-bedroom apartment to business-class flights, conferences, and interviews, Dan Parker was back. Only this time, he wasn't just employed. He was the boss. He upgraded his office, but never left Atlanta. "This city broke me," he said once. "So it's the same city that's going to watch me rise." Grace became his executive assistant, and eventually, his operations manager. Her calm, gentle strength kept him grounded when the world started calling him the new logistics visionary. Meanwhile, Melissa had vanished into luxury. Word spread that she was dating Marcus, the same VP she'd left Dan for. The tabloids called her Atlanta's corporate princess. But behind the glitz, the company Marcus ran was in trouble. And one day, a desperate email would change everything. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Grace walked into Dan's glass-walled office, tablet in hand. "You might want to see this," she said softly. On the screen was an email marked urgent, from Melissa Carter. Dan froze. For a moment, his heart forgot how to beat. He hadn't seen her name in years. Grace hesitated. "Should I delete it?" "No," Dan said calmly. "Open it." The email read, "Daniel, I know this may come as a shock, but I really need your help. Marcus's company has collapsed. The bank is threatening foreclosure. I'm trying to start a new venture, but every investor turned me down. Someone mentioned you're leading Blue Path now. I didn't realize you'd become so successful. Please, Daniel, I need funding. Just a chance. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate." Grace looked at him. "You don't owe her anything." Dan leaned back, silent for a moment, then whispered, "No, but I owe myself closure." He drafted a reply. "Let's meet in person. I'll see what I can do." Grace looked uneasy. "You're really going to meet her?" Dan nodded slowly. "Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, it's grace." The restaurant was one of Atlanta's finest, modern, glass ceilings, and a skyline view. Melissa walked in wearing a fitted white suit, her diamond earrings catching the light. But Dan didn't recognize her at first. The confidence that once filled every step was gone. When her eyes met his, she froze. "Dan?" she whispered. He stood slowly, leaning slightly on his cane. "It's been a while." She forced a smile. "You look different. Successful. Life has a way of turning," he said gently. They sat. She tried to control the tremor in her voice as she talked about her new business idea. Her words spilled out: investments, potential, debts, all carefully dressed in desperation. Dan listened quietly, watching the woman who once called him useless now call him Mr. Parker. When she finally paused, he said softly, "You know, Melissa, there was a time I would have done anything for you. I would have crawled if it meant keeping our home together. But you walked away the moment things got hard. Tears welled in her eyes. I was scared, Dan. I made mistakes. He smiled kindly. So did I. But I learned. Pain builds better men. He slid an envelope across the table. Open it tomorrow, he said. You'll have your answer. The next morning, Melissa sat alone in her small apartment. The marble floors and designer furniture were long gone, auctioned off when Marcus's company went bankrupt. All she had now was the envelope Dan had given her. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single check, made out for $0, and a note written in Dan's neat handwriting. Forgiveness granted. Investment denied. You taught me what love without loyalty looks like. Grace taught me what loyalty without wealth feels like. I chose the one that healed me. Tears rolled down her cheeks. At that same moment, Dan stood in the Blue Path conference room as his team celebrated their new billion-dollar valuation. Cameras flashed, reporters cheered. Grace stood beside him, smiling proudly. One journalist asked, "Mr. Parker, what's the secret to your success?" Dan looked at Grace, then back at the cameras. Gratitude, he said simply, and never forgetting the people who stayed when everyone else left. Later that evening, he found Melissa's email again, a long message filled with regret and apologies. He didn't reply. He simply whispered, "Thank you for leaving," because losing her had been the beginning of everything. A year later, Blue Path Solutions sponsored a charity gala for rehabilitation centers, the same kind that once helped Dan walk again. The ballroom was glowing with lights, laughter, and success stories. Guests whispered his name with admiration. Dan arrived in a black suit, Grace by his side. She wasn't the nanny anymore. She was now his business partner, his anchor, and the quiet force behind every good decision he made. As they stood by the stage, Mason, now a confident teenager, ran up and hugged his father. "They're calling you up, Dad," he said, eyes full of pride. Dan smiled. "Come stand with me, son." When he stepped to the microphone, he looked out at the crowd and began, "5 years ago, I was broken, jobless, injured, abandoned. But one person believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." He turned toward Grace. "That woman saved my life." The audience applauded. Grace wiped a tear quietly. Outside the venue, a familiar figure stood in the cold, Melissa, dressed in a fading coat, watching through the glass as the man she once discarded became everything she ever wanted. Inside, Dan held Grace's hand and whispered, This is home." And for the first time in his life, he truly meant it.